Welcome back, Camden Catholic. Man, it's been a minute. We haven't had a flip in like weeks, I want to say. But it's going to be a lot easier for me now, considering the fact that like lacrosse season is winding down a little bit. Also, because my AP kids are finishing up. So I want to be making like 3+ flips every week. All right. So anyway, I mean like per class every week anyway. But not like y'all really need to know why you're going to be getting more flips. Just know that you're going to be getting more flips, all right? But let's get into it. We left off in class talking about the new French flag, right? And how things are beginning to kind of get really chaotic in this whole French Revolution, right? So going forward, though, with that, you don't need that. But anyway, 2 new radical groups are going to begin to pop up, all right? So we are now officially, according to many European historians, entering the radical phase of the revolution, right? From about 1792 to about, give or take, probably about 1794, all right? Now, or whenever the Reign of Terror ended, so 1795. Some say 1798, but really depends on who you ask. So 2 new radical groups are going to pop up that are going to begin to compete for power in the National Assembly, right? So within the National Assembly, there are over 600 representatives. All of those 600 representatives don't necessarily agree on how the revolution should go, right? So of these 600 representatives, many of them are becoming split into smaller groups known as clubs, right? So the biggest one out of all of them was known right here as the Jacobin Club, right? Say Jacobin. Yes, the Jacobins, all right? So the Jacobins, right? Then you have the Girondins, right? So the Jacobins, though, are the bigger one, right? They're the much larger one, and they side with the mob. They encourage the violence. They want more of it. They are radical, violent, and they want to see heads rolling through the street. Whereas the Girondins are resisting the violence and actually try to calm the revolution down, right? So, fun fact, though, the Girondins did not pop up parallel to the Jacobins. They actually were a part of the Jacobins for a while. So when the Jacobins originally started, they were one really, really big group that included 2 separate smaller groups within them. One was called the Montagnards, which means mountain in French, right? Because they actually sat high up on these high benches in the National Assembly room. And then the other one was called the Girondins, which were much more calm and complacent. But as these things begin to spiral out of control and get super violent, the Girondins kind of make their own new group, right? And they're much more calm, they resist violence, and they want to kind of passively enter a little bit of an easier phase of the revolution. Now, I don't call them this with every class, right? Because I think it's easier to remember them by some nicknames, right? So you'll see really quickly down here on your left and right, there's Gary from SpongeBob and Jerry from Tom and Jerry, right? We are going to call these 2 groups from now on the Garys and the Jerrys, just to give you a little bit more of an easy time remembering them, right? So the Girondins we're going to call the Garys simply because they're calm, complacent, passive, meow, right? And then we're going to call the Jacobins Jerrys, because Jerry's chasing the cat around with a frying pan and blowing him up half the time, right? Very violent, very chaotic, very aggressive, right? So you have the Jerrys, the Jacobins, and you have the Garys, the Girondins, right? There you go. Well, things don't stay calm for long, and something actually breaks out, known as the September Massacres, right? The September Massacres break out in France, or in Paris, which is where roaming groups of poor people were killing prisoners in the streets, right? So out of fear that the Austrians might actually invade France, like the Jacobins encouraged these people to actually go into the streets and kill prisoners, right? So some of y'all are saying, well, like, why prisoners? And how were they getting a hold of them? Well, there were multiple prisons all over Paris by this time, right? Stocked full of enemies of the revolution. Well, the thing about it is, a lot of these Jacobins were like, wait a minute, if Austria, this is key. Make sure this isn't muted. Make sure you're listening. If I'm on closed captions, this is a bad time for it because my voice is kind of raspy and it might not pick me up the exact same, right? The Jacobins were afraid. They were afraid that if the Austrians or the coalition armies of Europe were to invade France, they might get a chance to recruit reinforcements for their armies in these prisons, because the prisons are full of enemies of the revolution, right? So if you get to the prisoners and then recruit them into your army, you've just now doubled the size of your army to take down the revolution in France. So out of fear, the Jacobins encourage a mob. We're back. Sorry about that. Just a quick phone call. But anyway, back to what we were talking about. The Jacobins encourage these people to go out and hold these like phony trials and then condemn these people to executions in the streets. You can actually see I can't zoom. You can see right here, okay, a man being decapitated in the street. You can see right here somebody holding the decapitated head of another man and somebody else awaiting execution. And it wasn't just men, and it wasn't just priests. A lot of them were priests, though, that had refused to take the civil constitution of the clergy oath, right? The refractory priests that were like, no, they're refusing to actually take it, okay? So also a lot of them were women. There were children involved in this, but month-long massacres, right? The monarchy was abolished officially after this because of its inability to control, and the king and queen are going to be officially arrested, and they're going to be some of the newest prisoners to go into these prisons. They're not going to be executed yet, though, right? Yet. So the constitutional monarchy is now over. We already have that. Now, because of all this, because of the fear of invasion, because of the fear of this thing that came down called the Declaration of Pillnitz, which is an AP concept that you don't really need to know, but the rest of Europe is very fearful of this revolution, okay? The Holy Roman Empire, the British, the Spanish, everybody in Europe, this is what you need to write down, everyone else in Europe is afraid of this revolution because they fear that there's a chance that this ideology of the Enlightenment might leak into their society and they might actually start revolutions of their own, right? So, to try and head this off, the new government, which they call themselves the French First Republic, declares war, right? Against a gang of other European countries. This word right here is very important, a coalition, right? So let's say hypothetically for a moment, let's use an example. Let's say hypothetically for a moment, Mr. Terry is leading a revolution of Camden Catholic inside of his room, which it sounds like that on a daily basis. You know what I mean? There's a football flying around. There's probably somebody being executed in the corner somewhere. But there's a revolution going on. There's a lot of these other teachers in Camden Catholic that just can't take it. They're like, you know what? If they're doing all that stuff in Mr. Terry's room, what if they want to do that stuff in our room? I don't have a football. What's a review game? Oh, so a coalition would be if Keogh, Hoover, who else? Miss Heck and Miss Magnaye formed a collective army together and decided to come and attack Mr. Terry, right? That's a coalition. It's a group, okay? Well, we all know who would win that fight. I'm just saying. Now, France declares war on Austria under their new two-party leaders to display their new power and strength, right? Now, jot this down somewhere on a side note. Napoleon, Napoleon, is a young general during this time, earning a big reputation, right? So, France's new government had major victories, ironically enough. You would think that a coalition army would absolutely smack this new France, but due to the fact that they were drafting their military, forcing people to serve, that they were also super hyped up with like revolutionary fervor, and they also wanted these reforms, France's new government has major victories. They invaded parts of current-day Germany, Egypt, Austria, and they successfully actually stole a lot of grain reserves so they could make more bread for the people. Right? So they actually ended up winning this first coalition war, the second one, and the third one, and the fourth one, and the fifth one, and it took all the way up until 6 coalition wars to actually destroy the French, right? So isn't that crazy? So during this whole phase, this new thing called a revolutionary tribunal is going to pop up, okay? Again, encouraged by the Jacobins, right? Meanwhile at home during this war, encouraged by the Jacobins, to keep the people happy, to keep the sans-culottes members happy. They gave them blood, all right? So to keep them thinking that the revolution was continuing to go forward, they began to put political leaders and aristocrats from the former Second Estate on trial, right? So The Girondins and the Jacobins created this thing together originally, right? So they begin to put them on trial. Usually these trials result in death. They're open to the public. They're chaotic. There is no appeal system whatsoever. And the trials particularly hate the royal family, right? So these revolutionary tribunals were huge. There's actually a very, 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 very big movie that relates to all this stuff that we're going to watch a clip of on Monday called The Dark Knight Rises that shows an image of a revolutionary tribunal, right? It's usually led by a member of the National Assembly, usually a Jacobin, right? And they vote on the people's, like once the person is found guilty, they vote on their sentence, and it usually resulted in death, right? Now, speaking of, this is what one of those revolutionary tribunals looked like. Notice the massive stands and all of the people coming in, right? It is not a calm event. There's yelling, there's screaming, there's people freaking out. You've got liberty, you get like liberty, equality, fraternity strung up in the very, very top of it. Also, you have all of these sticks with the revolutionary caps sitting on them that they made Louis wear the one time, right? This is intense. This is not like, I object, sir, order in the court. This is massive chaos, all right? So with this, though, they also bring in a new device, a tool, if you will, right? They bring in a thing. It's like they got it for Christmas. It's a big deal, all right? It's called the guillotine, right? The guillotine invented by no other than Monsieur Guillontine, right? It's actually a man's last name. It's the last name of the man that invented it. The guillotine is their new tool of execution, right? And this is the most important thing to write down. It is a fill-in-the-blank question on the test. The guillotine was adopted because it was considered equal, all right? The guillotine holds no prejudice. Everyone goes to it, and people will be executed the same way regardless of their wealth, right? Because back in the day, before the revolution began, wealthy really never got executed. They could buy their way out of it, right? So they could purchase their way out of being guilty. Whereas the poor, who had no ability to do that, could be executed in a variety of different ways. The wheel is one. Hanging was a very, very big one as well. Beheadings was one. But it always seemed that it was very unfair, because that is unfair, that a wealthy person could buy their way out. But with this new device, there is no because you have money, you get out of this, right? The guillotine kills all without relent, all right? And this is what it looked like, right? So it's actually about an 8-foot tall structure, right, that actually goes up. It's a weighted blade up top, and it's got a stock right here. The victim's head goes through, their neck is held right there, and then they lay across this bench, right? The string is then pulled, the blade comes down, cuts the head off, and the head falls in this basket, right? Now, here's another cool thing about it. It's painted red for a reason, and that's to hide the blood stains that it may possibly incur, right? Also, right here, you can see the seat flips up, so they can actually slide the body off. It falls through a trap door, and then they can put the next person up there. They would kill sometimes hundreds of people a day, right? So, and they would actually have these things usually mounted in a really, really big square in the middle of Paris so everyone could come and see. Right? So, because here's the thing. Ironically enough, the biggest guillotine and the one that was used the most during the French Revolution was placed in this place called the Place de Concorde. All right? So, this big, big square that was actually funded by Louis's grandfather, right? Louis XV actually had this place built, right? Well, guess who's going to be executed there next, right? Louis XVI is going to be executed in the square that his grandfather had built. Because the National Convention, or National Assembly is what we're going to also call them as well, is going to decide to put Louis on trial for his crimes, particularly treason against the revolution, right? He is then going to be, the Jacobins outnumbered the Girondins because they agreed that he was guilty, all right? They both agreed he was guilty. However, the Jacobins voted for his execution, where the Girondins did not. And they barely won. They won by a margin of like 20 votes, right? And they voted to execute him in January of 1793, right? We went from 1789 storming a Bastille to executing the King of France in 1793, like that, right? That is insane. And at the scaffold, he said, I forgive those who are guilty of my death. And then he laid down on the bench, Oh, and that's not his father. It's his grandfather. Sorry, typo. All right, so it's grandfather. It's his grandfather, right? He slid his head inside the stock. They lowered it down, locked his head into place. Lights out. Blade comes down. The executioner then grabbed Louis's head and showed it to the crowd, right? And they erupted in absolute madness, right? It's what the people at the time wanted, okay? And now we're going to enter into the next phase of the revolution on Monday, all right? So we're going to leave you here, all right, with this glorious little picture, and I'll see you guys then. Have a great rest of your weekend.